So there's something about poetry that I've been reflecting on recently in a deeper way, in a sort of more all-encompassing, mirrored sense. I've seen how poetry first precedes all language, and that was a big realization for me. And now I'm kind of seeing how it reflects life. There's a passion that I personally have with poetry that by me bottling that spark and expressing it to you, the insights that come from me immersing myself in that realm actually apply to various levels of experience, of human experience, because that is the nature of poetry, and that is the nature of symbolism, that is the nature of deep inner reflection, that is the nature of psychology, and even science, And what I'm going to try and do is weave my process, parts of the way that I engage with not writing poetry, but experiencing something in the place and state that I'm in when I choose to channel something from within myself, through myself. And that also extends to all artistic and creative endeavors, even what I'm doing now. Like I said, I'm spontaneously allowing something to come through and trusting that it will land. So yeah, for me, this all really started fairly recently, relatively speaking. Like, I have written poetry in my life, but I've never really immersed myself in the transmutational potential of art until about January last year. Went through an extremely dark night of the soul, and I found that putting myself in a place of zooming out, observing my suffering, realizing the futility of distractions. I had my phone available and I couldn't distract myself on the phone because the pain, the sort of heartache was too much for me to bear to do anything other than either sit with it or create from that place, move something from that place. And since then, I've connected so deeply to this process of poetry, because I've then found that once I've sat with that inner impression, that inner experience. It could be pain, suffering, heartache, heartbreak. It could also be inspiration, awe, adoration, yearning, all these real intense themes that speak to feeling a feeling to its extreme and not avoiding, not evading, not distracting ourselves. And it's not just the suffering that we're evading, it's actually the higher states, the higher unconscious, the precious gems of hope that actually are really, really hard to hold on to, because the more we hold on to it, the more we're aware that it could fall out of our hands at any moment, and there comes with it a grief there. So even the highest, most joyful states come with I don't want to say the promise of a low, but they kind of do, because of the nature of polarity in this world. Everything has its opposite in order for it to express. So joy obviously has its opposite. So it's hard to hold on to something like that, because we know we're going to have to experience the other side. So most of us, we try and kind of just sit in this stagnant, just about comfortable edge. We have different states available to us as human beings, and we're always making a choice on that spectrum. I'll often make a choice to distract or evade, and I will feel pretty shit and purposeless after I do that. And there's an apathy that comes with that, and that's very dangerous, I feel like, sometimes more dangerous than the suffering itself. So when I was in this place of suffering for the first time in my life, after I had cultivated a certain amount of, awareness of my journey and potentially where things were leading me, why I was experiencing certain things, the classic adage that life is happening for me and not to me, not being a victim of our circumstances, and instead feeling somewhat empowered by the sort of brutal acceptance that on some level we have created the reality that we so find uncomfortable now. And on various levels, that is a very sort of precarious statement to make, and I'm aware of that, and I really don't mean to say that in a really flippant way. I have no idea what it feels like to be in some specific situations, some specific experiences and of suffering. I have my own personal subjective and relative experience of suffering. And leaning into that has transformed my life, and I believe therefore the same can apply to everybody. And certainly the things I have read and converse with people who inspire me and speak to something that is deep-seated inside of myself, that is corroborated, affirmed that that's true. And there's some words actually from D.H. Lawrence which spoke to me about the intense emotions that maybe wanted to be expressed on the page. He says, "I have always tried to get an emotion out in its own course without altering it. It needs the finest instinct imaginable, much finer than the skill of a craftsman." That kind of emotional secretion and just allowing it to come out and not intellectualizing it is so much of what it's all about, and it's so much of what I'm still practicing now. I've had a few people ask me about my process in how I create or write poetry. There is something about leaning into that shadow, that lingering shadow, that darkness, that suffering that we're evading. It gets me into states where I have to sit with something and create from that place. And as I'm in that place, I'm kind of like taking myself out of the situation. There's an identified part of myself in my suffering saying, I am this pain, I am this emotion that is moving through. And with even just with the intention to create, we can be in a certain place where we just allow a scene or images to unfold. And a lot of the times when I'm looking to express how something has impacted me, or even an experience, or a mundane experience, or a profound day out that I had, I always try and find another way of saying. There's an obvious way of describing something on a certain level, which captures an essence of what you did. But you realize, you read it back, say you journal, and you realize you've described your day, and you've read it back like a week or years later, and you think, no, it's a bit uninteresting. I didn't really get the flavor of what was coming across there, because there's a limitation to description. So what I always try and do is find, allow a kind of metaphor to unfold and just let it kind of grow. And I don't know how else to describe it, but that's being in that place, that state, is what gives me so much life. I'm trying to almost reclaim the word poetry, because it's something that speaks to me so much, but it's not the way that I have always thought of the word, which is why I'm kind of redefining it. But it's not a redefinition, because it's been out there for a while that this is what poetry is. In fact, at some point we lost what it was. We lost the kind of ancient seer that a poet was, and that speaks to, even Rambo, who I've been reading lately. He does use the word seer. He also uses the term visionary. He says, when at 17 years old, he says, the poet makes himself a visionary through a long, prodigious and rational disordering of all the senses. Every form of love, of suffering, of madness, he searches himself. He consumes all the poisons in him, keeping only their quintessences. Ineffable torture in which he will need all his faith and superhuman strength, for he arrives at the unknown, since he has cultivated his soul, richer to begin with than any other. That speaks so much to what I was bringing earlier about how I got into poetry, with the kind of ineffable torture at times. There's suffering involved, but there's such a magic quintessence. He says you consume all the poisons inside of you. In other words, that kind of innate human capacity for all of these darker elements of life. It's natural. There's light and there's dark, and we have these poisons, and most of us conceal and hide it, even from ourselves. I'm not necessarily saying we all need to start blurting out every single dark truth about ourselves that we don't like. I'm more just saying there's a way to channel that into art. Our biggest insecurities, our biggest fears, our doubts, even the things that we might be ashamed of or guilty for. Yeah, I think making meaning from what arises from the unconscious is another fascinating area that I'm going to speak more on. And one of my video ideas coming up will be a sort of process I have devised and that I intend to, help walk people through, that allows material to arise from your unconscious, let these processes move through us and ultimately grow and bind all of the fragments of our history and those that we are currently creating and segmenting into a wholeness that allows us just to feel more like ourselves. I mean, I think that's what everyone wants in this day and age. It's just a bit of like a sense of wholeness, which I think for me, poetry is the language that I'm able to express that passion through. And that's a huge theme of this endeavor of mine. And the stage of life that I'm in now, I just love it. And as I say, I don't need it to be reciprocated on a literary sense. I'm not telling people they need to write poetry or read my poetry. It's much more about a kind of expression of an inner glow in me that feels like it needs to be shared. And again, that's another really powerful topic to speak on. How do we allow that to come through if we are called to share something with the world or other people? So yeah, I think that's going to be all for now. This spontaneous flow has found its resolution, and see you next time.